Hi, everyone. I'm Elaine Quijano. President Trump says he will impose sanctions on Turkey for its assault in northern Syria. This comes after he ordered American troops out of Syria. But now the president says some will remain in the region to prevent the resurgence of ISIS. This all comes as Turkey advances on the formerly U.S.-backed Kurds. Catherine Johnson has more on the fallout.
Members of President Trump's national security team met for a second day as Turkish forces continue to pummel northern Syria. Over the weekend, President Trump ordered a pullback of U.S. troops in the region. The Kurds have turned to Russian-backed Syrian forces aligned with dictator Bashar Assad to defend against the Turkish advancement. Meanwhile, some of nearly 11,000 captured ISIS fighters and their supporters have reportedly escaped. President Trump hinted on Twitter the Kurds may be releasing some ISIS prisoners to get the U.S. involved in the fighting. He also added big sanctions on Turkey coming.
The sanctions are ready to go. When he makes the decision, we'll act accordingly.
Members of Congress are also working on a sanctions package to punish Turkey, separate from any action taken by the White House. Senator Lindsey Graham took his push for bipartisan sanctions to Fox News Channel Monday.
There's going to be crippling sanctions imposed by the Congress to supplement what President Trump's administration has done. We're going to send a signal to Turkey that's unmistakable.
Senator Graham and House Speaker Nancy Pelosi have discussed plans for a sanctions bill on the phone. Speaker Pelosi fired off a series of tweets saying Congress should also pass a joint resolution to overturn the president's decision to withdraw from Syria, in addition to passing a stronger sanctions package than the White House. The largest population of Kurds in the U.S. is in Nashville, Tennessee, where people held a rally in solidarity with loved ones back in Syria. Catherine Johnson, CBS News, the White House.
Joining me now are Jill Colvin and Sheryl Stolberg. Jill covers the White House for the Associated Press, and Sheryl covers Congress for the New York Times. Welcome to both of you. Jill, I'd like to begin with you. Do we know, first of all, who or what could be targeted by these new economic sanctions?
Yeah, so we just found out the president tweeted just a little while ago that he intends to sign an executive order. The timing on that is unclear, but he provided some details saying that the sanctions would target specifically Turkish government officials, people who are directly involved in this offensive. Also says that he is planning to increase the steel tariffs back to 50% on Turkey, and also saying that he intends to completely cease all negotiations on a trade deal between the U.S. and Turkey. Right now, we've got Senator Lindsey Graham is actually meeting with White House officials right now. We're expecting him to come out hopefully soon and give us some kind of briefing. And so we'll hear how he, he's been talking about how he would like Congress to impose additional sanctions. And so we'll hear how he feels like Congress should supplement what the White House intends to do here.
Well, and Jill, how confident is the White House that these sanctions will actually convince Turkey to end its offensive?
Well, I think that's a good question, and we haven't heard a lot from the White House today on this topic, aside from this statement they just put out. But it certainly sounds from folks at the Pentagon, especially from Esper over there, he doesn't seem particularly confident. It sounds from his latest comments that he is pretty distressed at everything that Turkey is doing right now. Feels like they're turning their back on the U.S., that they're turning their back on their NATO allies, and siding closer and closer with Russia here. And there's a lot of concern about how this relationship is potentially, just kind of breaking apart.
Joining me now are Jill Colvin and Sheryl Stolberg. Jill covers the White House for the Associated Press, and Sheryl covers Congress for the New York Times. Welcome to both of you. Jill, I'd like to begin with you. Do we know, first of all, who or what could be targeted by these new economic sanctions?
Yeah, so we just found out the president tweeted just a little while ago that he intends to sign an executive order. The timing on that is unclear, but he provided some details saying that the sanctions would target specifically Turkish government officials, people who are directly involved in this offensive. Also says that he is planning to increase the steel tariffs back to 50% on Turkey, and also saying that he intends to completely cease all negotiations on a trade deal between the U.S. and Turkey.
Well, and Jill, how confident is the White House that these sanctions will actually convince Turkey to end its offensive?
Well, I think that's a good question, and we haven't heard a lot from the White House today on this topic, aside from this statement they just put out. But it certainly sounds from folks at the Pentagon, especially from Esper over there, he doesn't seem particularly confident. It sounds from his latest comments that he is pretty distressed at everything that Turkey is doing right now. Feels like they're turning their back on the U.S., that they're turning their back on their NATO allies, and siding closer and closer with Russia here. And there's a lot of concern about how this relationship is potentially, just kind of breaking apart.
Meantime, Sheryl, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell says he plans to meet with other senators and Trump administration officials this week to discuss Syria. We've heard members of Congress speak out in opposition to this move, but what actual power do they have to do something about it?
Well, they do have the power to impose sanctions on Turkey, but frankly, more than that, they have the power to lean on the president. I think we're at a very extraordinary moment where you're seeing the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, a man who really there's very rarely any daylight between him and President Trump, and in a not so veiled message to the president, he issued a statement saying he wants to avoid, I'm paraphrasing here, strategic disaster in the Middle East. So you've got Republicans and Democrats equally up in arms on Capitol Hill. As you mentioned, they're all getting ready to come back to Washington from a 2-week recess. A lot of them are just scratching their heads at the way this president has kind of turned Syria policy on its head. And I think this could be a rare moment where we see bipartisan cooperation on this crisis in the Middle East from Congress.
Sheryl, I know you have covered Washington for a long time, but certainly we're in a situation that many people describe with this administration as being unprecedented. I mean, the number of times we've used that word, but you talk about lawmakers having the power to lean on the president. Does it look like there are any indications that lawmakers will actually do that in this case?
Well, I think Lindsey Graham will probably lean on the president. Senator Graham is probably the president's closest ally on Capitol Hill. He is somebody who the president does listen to. He's got the president's ear. He's a strong and serious, hawkish voice, of course, on foreign policy. I think it remains to be seen whether this president will listen. He never ceases to surprise us. Every time you think you know what President Trump is going to do next, he manages to switch course. But I do think that there's a great level of concern in Washington about the events that are unfolding in the Middle East. And surely he will at least listen to what congressional leaders have to say. Whether or not he does what they say is another matter.
So, Jill, let me ask you, from your vantage point there, tell us how the president has publicly responded to criticism coming from within his own party, but also privately, what is it that you're hearing from White House officials about this very forceful response to the president's move?
Yeah, I mean, this president is not somebody who likes to be criticized at all, and we have seen him both publicly and privately really just hitting the same messaging point, saying, look, my supporters elected me to get the U.S. out of these lengthy wars. He's talked again and again about how he really hates the part of the job where he has to write letters to the parents and family members of young people who are killed in the line of duty fighting in the Middle East. He just does not feel like it is a worthwhile U.S. enterprise to be fighting in this part of the world, and doesn't, believes that the U.S. has fought beside the Kurds, but feels like, and he said that this is a long battle between the Kurds and the Turks that he doesn't want to be in the middle of, and he wants to take a very hands-off approach. Now, that's obviously a position that is not held by some people at the White House, certainly people across the Defense Department, the people who have been on the ground, who have been fighting these wars, strongly disagree with him, and obviously members on the Hill agree with that too. But this president is somebody who, again and again, just seems to dig in every time that he he is attacked. And even though you have seen, that break in support and that outpouring among Republicans, it's still unclear whether that's actually enough to be able to sway him. We did, however, in the statement released today, the president said that he does intend to keep, there are about 1,000 troops that were in northeast Syria, and he said that he intends to keep at least a portion of those troops in the region. It's unclear exactly what that means, but it does sound at least a little bit like maybe he is responding to some of the concerns about, well, what happens to all of these, Islamic State prisoners? What are you going to do with these people, and how is the U.S. going to continue to exert pressure in the region to prevent ISIS from regaining power?
Right, because we've heard lawmakers from both sides of the aisle express concern that that could have a direct effect on our own national security here in the homeland. Let's turn to the impeachment inquiry. Sheryl, the president's former Russia advisor, Fiona Hill, was on Capitol Hill today testifying as part of the impeachment inquiry into President Trump. What was she expected to tell lawmakers?
Well, we know that Fiona Hill was very, very concerned that the president's lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, was kind of running a shadow foreign policy in Ukraine, that Trump administration policy toward Ukraine was not going through the normal channels of the NSC, which is where Fiona Hill worked. And so I think she was expected to express that concern. She, I think, had concern over the firing of the ambassador who testified last week behind closed doors. So I think what we will hear, if we hear anything that comes out of this closed door testimony, is that Fiona Hill, who is a serious foreign policy advisor, was, worried about what was going on inside the Trump White House and why things were not happening according to normal protocols.
Well, Jill, how does that line up with the White House's version of events?
I mean, the White House's version of events here is that the president did absolutely nothing wrong, that he is, completely squeaky clean, and that Congress is engaged in an unprecedented, assertion of power that it doesn't possess as it tries to call in these witnesses, which of course just isn't the case. It's interesting because Fiona Hill is the first White House official to actually appear, and she'd said that she was coming in voluntarily, but there was an interesting twist this morning where we found out that the committee had actually subpoenaed her to appear nonetheless, which raises some interesting questions about the reason why they chose to do that. And we've heard that there were some concerns about the White House potentially attempting to limit not only who appears, but trying to maybe place some limitations on witnesses' testimony as they come in. And so it looks like Adam Schiff, who is in charge of the investigation, just wanted to make sure that she would be able to speak kind of freely about all the areas they want to talk to her about.
Interesting. Well, Sheryl, who else might House committees leading the impeachment probe hear from this week?
Well, so this week is going to be a very, very busy week on Capitol Hill. We're going to hear from Gordon Sondland, the ambassador to the European Union. You might remember that he was supposed to come last week, and he was a no-show. The committee issued a subpoena for him. We'll hear from the two allies or associates of Rudy Giuliani. We're expected to hear from them. I don't think that that's actually nailed down yet, but who have been indicted. There'll be a State Department official who is also going to testify. All of this will happen behind closed doors, but it indicates that Chairman Schiff and the Democrats really want to move very quickly through these witnesses. And one person we may not hear from actually is the whistleblower who started all of this. Adam Schiff said yesterday that he was concerned about the whistleblower's safety. He wasn't sure that the whistleblower would actually be called as a witness, and there are questions about how much this whistleblower is needed. Maybe the committee has gleaned so much information already from that initial whistleblower report that they've kind of gone beyond that. But it's going to be a busy week when they come back tomorrow.
Yes, a lot to watch. Well, Jill, CBS News has confirmed the Department of Justice is looking into whether the president's personal lawyer violated foreign lobbying regulations in Ukraine. Can you break down for us what exactly Rudy Giuliani is under scrutiny for?
I mean, there are so many questions at this point about what exactly the president's lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, was doing as he made all of these calls and all of this contact with Ukrainian officials, the extent to which he was, potentially promising or threatening to withhold this aid money in exchange potentially for, the Ukrainian government reopening its investigation into Joe Biden's son and the circumstances of his work with one of the big energy companies there, and his frequent trips. And there's just a lot of questions about what he has done here. But what is extraordinary about all of this is the fact that the president's lawyer, the president's attorney, Rudy Giuliani, is now sucked personally into the middle of this. And it comes at this time of intense questioning about who is even on the president's legal team. We had the White House, or at least the outside counsel, announce that Trey Gowdy was joining the president's team. And then they realized sort of after the fact, after the news had already been pushed out, that there were restrictions that prevented him from actually doing that job until he'd been out of Congress for a full year. So he couldn't actually start that job until January. There's a lot of finger pointing at the White House about who was responsible for that debacle. And so you've got a president who has a very small team around him. And at this point, they're having trouble, bringing in people. And you've got the president's lawyer who now needs his own lawyer. And it's just a very complicated situation.
Yes, we definitely need some graphics here to kind of keep up with the legal team changes of the day. Sheryl, on Face the Nation yesterday, Texas Republican Senator Ted Cruz said that he'd like to see Rudy Giuliani testify before lawmakers. Is that something that seems likely to happen?
Well, whether or not it seems likely to happen, it seems like it could, frankly, be disastrous for President Trump. I mean, I think one of the things that the president's lawyers have to be worried about is that Rudy Giuliani has been all over television. He's kind of loose. He's loose-lipped, to say the least. I think that's putting it politely. And one thing that I find intriguing is that as investigators close in on Rudy Giuliani, is he going to turn on the president? I mean, we saw this happen with Michael Cohen, the president's former personal lawyer, who said early on in the administration, he would lay down and give his life for the president. Well, guess what? He didn't. He kind of walked that way back.
They just had lunch, though, didn't they?
Rudy Giuliani and President Trump did just have lunch, which I thought was also very intriguing. Like, the president was not quite clear last week about whether or not he was still supporting Rudy Giuliani. So some seem to think that this was a way of the president showing publicly that he does support Rudy Giuliani. Maybe it's a way of him just holding Giuliani close because, he knows that maybe Giuliani knows where the bodies are buried, if you will. The dynamic between these two is really interesting. So I think if Rudy Giuliani does testify on Capitol Hill, that is going to be one that is worth watching.
Absolutely. All right, Jill, before we move on, I want to ask you on a serious note about a violent parody video depicting a fake Donald Trump shooting media organizations that played at the president's Miami resort. Do we know where that video came from, and what is the White House saying in response?
Yeah, so what we've figured out today is that video actually has been on YouTube since last summer. It was posted by this user who posts a ton of these sort of memes, these mashups, many of them featuring the same kind of scheme with, they'll take scenes from movies and they'll, crop the president's face onto some of the characters. Oftentimes he'll be depicted, fighting as a superhero, trying to defeat his political enemies, and the news media depicted among those people. So the White House today finally responded to this. We had Press Secretary Stephanie Grisham tweeting that the president had not actually seen the video yet, but that from everything he'd heard, that he strongly condemned the content. I've been asking the White House all day whether the president has actually seen that video yet. It's about 2 minutes, and it's pretty readily available on Twitter. I have not heard back yet, but at this point we haven't heard the president directly address it from his own Twitter account or with a direct statement.
All right, Jill Colvin and Sheryl Stolberg, a lot to get through on this Monday. Thanks to you both for helping us do that.